his feet. Member for Mawson.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. I rise to join this condolence motion for the man I believe was the greatest Prime Minister Australia's ever had. And I want to point out, a lot of people have mentioned that Bob Hawke was born in Bordertown and a famous son of the South East, but it's worth pointing out that the South East is hardly a hotbed of Labor politics. In fact, as someone who was also born and brought up down in the South East, I had an auntie called Auntie Gurley who, from the earliest age of us watching television, when Bob Hawke was the ACTU president, every time he'd come on the TV, my great aunt Gurley would make a little hand motion like a pistol, and she'd go like this and click her fingers to shoot Bob Hawke on the telly. So he wasn't exactly the toast of the town in the South East, shall we say. But a lot of people have also talked, and we all remember how Bob Hawke's slogan in that 1983 election campaign was bringing Australia together, and I think he really did that. As a 16-year-old in 1983, I was doing politics, economics and a few other subjects like communications at Blackfriars Primary School. So I was in Year 11 in 1983. I went in my school uniform without a ticket to the Festival Theatre to see Bob Hawke give his stump speech about bringing Australia together and why he wanted Australians to vote for him and his vision a week or so later. And it was interesting to hear Chris Schott the other day, who was the State Secretary at the time, and he said that when Hawke said he wanted this 2,000-seat auditorium booked, that Chris was a little bit worried because Bob Hawke had only been the leader of the Australian Labor Party at the federal level for a matter of weeks. Obviously, he came in after Bill Hayden moved aside. And so Shotty was a little bit concerned that they might have 2,000 seats and not have a very big audience there. Well, Shotty reckons about 5,000 people turned up. I remember getting there really early, sneaking in and getting a seat front and centre, as I said, in my school uniform. And I sat there, again, let's just go back to where I was brought up, in the South East, with a family that had always voted Country Party or Liberal Party, with the exception of Dad, who voted for Des Corcoran because he said Des was a good bloke who worked hard for the area, so he voted for the man rather than the party. So I'm sitting there pretty much indoctrinated since my birth, and all through those Whitlam years where Dad really was really upset with Gough Whitlam. I don't know why, and his vision, but that's what I remembered. But at Blackfriars I had some outstanding teachers. Renee Shinkle and I used to sit there and have great discussions and debates. I think the rest of the class was asleep. But Renee was a big supporter of Gough Whitlam, and he took one view of the dismissal, and as a 16-year-old I had a different view at the start of the year. My economics teacher was Kathy Snelling, Jack Snelling's mum, who obviously went to Blackfriars as well before coming in here. So anyway, so I've turned up to this thing with Bob Hawke, and he's talked about bringing Australians together. He says this isn't about bosses versus workers. This is about bosses and workers sitting around the table together and coming up with agreements, of course, which went on to become the Accord. And I'd never seen so many people so excited. It was almost as big as the Split Ends concerts that I used to go back to back then. People really excited by a guy, because Bob Hawke had charisma. And anyone who was ever in a room with Bob Hawke will know that he had charisma. So despite 16 years of living in the family home, being indoctrinated one way in politics, Bob Hawke, he didn't totally get me over the line that night, but he sort of led me on a path that Labor might be a better option. And at the end of his speech, and great rapturous applause, I raced out got under the security ropes in between a couple of security guards or federal police and grabbed whatever I could on the way, and it just happened to be a Greens triangular no damn sticker, and I had my pen on me and I got him to sign it. I've still got that Bob Hawke signed no damn sticker along with my Bringing Australia Together stickers, about 5 of those left. I've got my Bob for Jobs badge as well. But that was a defining moment in my life that night, just a week or 10 days before the federal election of 1983. But I've since met a lot of people who went out and joined the Labor Party after being there that night, who had no consideration about joining a political party until they heard Bob Hawke speak at the festival centre that night. Fast forward a few years and I'm working as a journalist and got to meet Mr Hawke a few times because not only through press conferences and things like that, but one of my friends, very dear friends, at the Adelaide News, while I was a cadet journalist, Janine Young became a cadet photographer. Now, Janine's dad was Mick Young, and so I'd quite often be down at Janine's place, and Mick was always there, sort of with plenty of advice on my family upbringing from down the southeast and who I should be voting for. But quite often Bob was there as well, particularly if you went around on a Saturday morning. Bob and Mick would be sitting out on the sun decks at Sun Lake Place, at Tennyson there, and they'd be going through the form guides. And Mick had this big commander phone at home with about 6 lines coming in, and we all thought it was because he was Special Minister of State and Immigration Minister. It was so he could have, you know, the people ring in from Sydney and Melbourne and all around Australia each morning, and each Saturday morning to get the latest mail. And in fact, speaking to Janine, she said that she knew all the racetracks in Australia from the age of 5 because Bob Hawke used to ring up on a Saturday morning and she'd have to take big long notes if Mick was on the other line. So I got to meet Bob a few times there, but one time that really stands out was 1987 when he came over with Mick, who was the member for Port Adelaide, and also Kim Beazley, who was the Defence Minister, and they came to Adelaide to announce that the Collins-class submarines would be built here in Adelaide. It was a tremendous announcement. We went down to the Brompton Park Hotel, which was then run by Mick's son Michael, and then on down to the Colac Hotel, which was owned by the Labor Party. And there was a great little band that Mick used to get to all of his shows called the Good Time Rascals. They sang well into the night. Hawkey sort of slipped off a bit earlier, but I remember Kim Beazley and Mick Young standing up on the table singing "We All Live in a Yellow Submarine" until well after midnight, and then the Irish songs came out as well. So Bob was a terrific fella who brought all Australians together, and the Deputy Leader mentioned before about how Australians loved Bob Hawke and Bob Hawke loved Australians. I think the other thing is worth saying is that Australians trusted Bob Hawke. So even though he asked Australians to change in a way that we'd never seen change of that scale before, we kind of trusted Bob Hawke not to do the wrong thing by us, and he took us on a journey of great change. You know, bringing in a different industrial relations system where there was more discussion on both sides, floating the dollar, making huge tariff changes and other changes that really strengthened the Australian economy for years to come. So you can't bring about change without people trusting those people who are going to take you on that journey of change. On the 2001 federal campaign, a little bit like our leader, I got to go down to the airport and pick up Bob and Blanche and take them around, and it is incredible to see the impact that he had on people, even 10 years or so after he'd left the role of Prime Minister, that people still idolised Bob Hawke and wanted a photo with him and autographs and the like. And I should also mention a fellow called Bob Bell. Now, I'm not sure whether too many people will remember Bob Bell, but he's someone that I thought the member for Giles might have mentioned, because in 1989, Bob Hawke was up in Whyalla, just doing a visit to Whyalla, and some bloke's giving him a bit of lip, and Bob's just yelled at, yeah, you silly old bugger, like as Bob would, and it became the big national story for about 3 days. But it just shows you that Bob never lost his approach, that you could sort of, it didn't matter that he was the Prime Minister, he could still interact with people and have a little bit of a go. If they were having a go at him, he'd have a little bit of a shot back at them and things like that. So I think Bob Hawke will be remembered, as I said, in my view. I think he was our greatest ever Prime Minister. He will be remembered as someone who changed the Australian economy. But we should, and not just the economy, but also our sense of social justice as well, because he took people who may have had a particular view on race, on gender, and other things, and he kind of made it okay for those people to change their mind on that and to be more caring and more understanding of other people's points of view. I think we should never forget that great thing that he did for Australia. So he had an immense effect on us as a nation, but he also had an immense effect on us as individuals. And as I mentioned, in that 1983 function that so many of us went to at the Festival Centre, who weren't aligned with the Labor Party but just wanted to go along and see Bob Hawke in action, he changed so many of us. He had such an effect on us. And I want to then skip forward a generation to 7 years ago, when I took my son Connor, who was then 14, along to see Bob Hawke give a talk on Asia. And Connor was doing his third year of high school study in Mandarin and Chinese, and he heard Bob Hawke talk about how important Asia was, how important China was. And then afterwards I introduced Connor to Bob Hawke, and Bob was just, it was like Connor was the only bloke in the room, and he gave him his time and he spoke to him about, you know, what do you want to do in the future, and Connor, and what are you doing now? And he said, well, I'm studying Mandarin. How are you finding it? Well, I'm finding it really tough. And Connor was about to pull out of his Mandarin studies. But Bob Hawke inspired Connor at that meeting to persevere with it, and that he did. At the end of that year, he spent 3 months of Year 10 living with a Chinese family in Shanghai and studying Chinese over there. He's actually in China at the moment on his 5th trip to China. And as he said to me the night we heard about Hawke's death, he said, it was so hard to do Chinese. And he goes, but those words that Bob Hawke spoke to me inspired me to stick with it and go on with my studies. And he's really glad he did. I'm really glad that Bob sort of snapped me out of the conservative political beliefs that I had as a 16-year-old. And I think Connor and I and a lot of Australians are in a better place because of Bob Hawke.